Hi, welcome back to our study chapter by chapter through the book of Genesis. We are in this session in chapter 37. So now we're beginning the section that begins the Joseph narrative and probably the most well known part of the book of Genesis. Certainly, you can take this section all by itself, and many preachers have and done sermon series or studies. And it is a compelling story because we see the drama of this incredibly dysfunctional family. We are going to see the hand of God, his providence throughout the story, and it will eventually leave us with the nation of Israel in Egypt, which of course is going to set us up for the whole book of Exodus and everything that happens there. And as the story of God's redemptive purposes through Israel continues to move forward. So, but just in this chapter, 37, what do we see? Well, we see Jacob's troubled 12, and we see the table that's being set for some family trouble. There's just some really bad dynamics that are taking place here in this family. And just in the first few verses, Moses, the writer, just kind of lays it all out there to help us understand why all these things are going to begin to happen, because we begin to see just how bad it was in this family. And it begins with Jacob himself and his favoritism as the father toward Joseph. Now, don't misunderstand, Joseph is not being favored because he's the baby. Because remember, Benjamin is the baby. The reason that Joseph is being favored is because he's the firstborn of his beloved Rachel, the wife that he always favored. Remember, he had 4 wives, which he had 12 sons. But Rachel was always the favorite, and everybody knew it. So as a consequence, Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, is now his favorite. And we see that he gives him this extravagant clothing, and the brothers can sense easily, it's not in their imagination, that he loves Joseph more than he loves them. We also see Joseph is young. He's not mature, and he seems to have some imprudence himself. We're told early on that he gives a bad report on his brothers, and we don't really understand exactly how this might have worked. I think it seems that Joseph was the one that's tended to stay at home, but yet his father depended on him to give him some reports about his brothers. We're going to see Jacob sending Joseph later in the story out to find his brothers, to bring back a report of how things are going with them. So those two things might be connected, but again, it's another place of resentment for these older brothers that Joseph, in some way, at least in the past, has given a bad report on them. I don't know if he's a tattler or whatever it may be, but it's certainly a point of tension. We also see the dreams. It's interesting because the dreams we know are of God, and it's an indication early on that God is with Joseph in a very unique and special way. But he has these dreams, and both of these dreams, one about sheaves and one about celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, both of them have the same point, that Joseph is saying at some point in these dreams that he's having and telling his family, one day all of you are going to bow down to me. And I don't know about you, but if I had that dream, I might have been more like Mary, who had the vision. The angel appeared, and it just says she pondered these things in her heart and kept them to herself. It might have been more prudent if Joseph had just kept that to himself, but he seems to lack the maturity to understand that this is just going to be driving the wedge even deeper between him, particularly, and his brothers. And then we just see the brothers are just given over to hate and jealousy. It tells us that several times in the first few verses. In verse 4, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than all the other brothers, they hated him. They could not speak peaceably to him. There was always conflict. And then later on, when Joseph was telling about the dreams, it says in verse 8, the brothers, hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And then there at the very end, verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him. So we have from the outset just this explosive situation that's just waiting for an opportunity. And that's what happens next in the story. all of this hatred, all of this jealousy meets an opportunity. We see that Jacob sends Joseph out to find the brothers who are some distance away from home. They're tending to the flocks. And when he is coming to them, the brothers see him coming, and they already have such hatred. They've already apparently been talking about this to some degree that they quickly decide, hey, let's kill him. Now, I don't think that's something that you come to quickly or lightly. This is something that has been simmering for some time. This is something that they have had to have been talking about together, how much they resented him and hated him and how their lives would be better if he were just gone. And so now this opportunity presents itself, and they literally want to kill him. Now, this is bad in a family. Now, it's interesting that Reuben, who is the firstborn, intercedes. He keeps them, the others, from killing him at that point. And Reuben is the one, he's the oldest. He's the one that's going to have to answer, to be responsible. And there may be some compassion within him as well. But he says, let's just throw him in this pit. So I guess he convinces, at least by implication to his brothers, that let's not directly kill him. Let's just throw him in this pit and allow him to die naturally, I suppose. But it also tells us that Reuben had the intention to come back and rescue him out of that pit, maybe when his brothers weren't looking, and deliver him back to his father. So in the meantime, while Joseph is in the pit, we learn later in the story that he cried out. His brothers had no mercy on him. But at that time, God in his providence sent this caravan of traders, of merchants. And it's interesting that we learn that they are Ishmaelites, also referred to as Midianites. So Ishmaelite may have been the broader term, going all the way back to Ishmael from Abraham. Midianite may have been the more local term and ethnicity. They seem to be interchangeable to some degree. And they see an opportunity to get rid of Joseph, but they can also make a little money too in the process. And so they sell them. It's interesting that they're Ishmaelites, because it takes us all the way back to the rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael, the sons of Abraham. And of course, that rivalry continued with Jacob and Esau. Now that rivalry is continuing among brothers between Joseph and the rest of his brothers. So they sell him. And the chapter ends with the brothers deceiving their father. They take the coat that was especially given to Joseph as a symbol of Jacob's favoritism, and they make it look as if Joseph has been killed and devoured by a wild animal. The father is inconsolable, and we can only imagine how the brothers must have felt with this deception, and the deception that they kept up for years, allowing their father to mourn and to suffer. And it ends by telling us that meanwhile, as they were taking that fake news back to Jacob, that Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar just happens to be an important official in Pharaoh's royal court. Now, how do we apply and have some takeaways from this story? Well, first of all, we have the privilege of knowing the end of the story. We have the privilege of understanding that things are going to work out. And we can see in hindsight, because we know the story most likely, how God is using these circumstances to accomplish his purposes. Even though the favoritism of Jacob is hurtful to the brothers, God's using that. Although the hatred and the jealousy of the brothers becomes treacherous, God is still going to use that. And even Joseph himself, how naive he is, God is still using that in all of this to accomplish his purposes. God is arranging things. He's using those things, and we can see those things in hindsight. But imagine with me just for a second to be in that moment, and particularly to be in Joseph's shoes in that moment. You don't know all that yet. You don't understand all that yet. All you know is that your brothers have betrayed you. Now they've sold you. Now you find yourself in a place where you have to be young and afraid, and everything has become so uncertain, and you have to be hurting tremendously. Well, the lesson for us to learn is that everything that appears to be negative and bad and even devastating at times, with enough time and faith in God, we will see that it's true that God does, through all things, work good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. It doesn't mean that the things that happen are good, because a lot of bad things happen. But we always trust and believe that God is firmly in control. And that even through the trials, even through the difficulties, there's purpose. There's something that He's up to for His own glory, for His own will, and we will in time understand it and see it. Joseph doesn't understand it now, but his great confession at the end will be that he now sees all of that. And I know that the older that I get, the more God gives me the privilege to see some of those things. And I just have to trust in the present when I'm going through things that I don't understand, that are hurtful and hard and difficult, that given enough time, either in this life or the next, I'm going to see where God was at work. And He just calls me in the present to trust in His character, His goodness, and His love and His compassion that never changes in all of these things. And in time, if it's His will, He'll reveal those things and we'll understand. We'll continue to read in Genesis, and we'll see you right back here, and we'll pick up in chapter 38.